Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to a special episode of the Wasatch Report. I'm your host, Suzanne Sherman, and you've tuned into the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. Very special guest today. My good friend Dave Benner is joining us again. He is a historian. He's the author of two of my favorite books, The 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine. This is it right here. We're doing video today. Hello, here it is right here. And I'm covering your name, Dave Benner, right there. And Compact of the Republic, the League of States, and the Constitution. We love to dispel a lot of myths and untruths, ladies and gentlemen, over here at the Cerberus Radio Network, and this is just one more means by which we do so. We're bringing historians that really do the heavy lifting. I get really embarrassed. I'll tell you, when I go on and do some AM radio shows out here in Salt Lake City, I'm often referred to as an expert on the Constitution and a constitutional attorney. And it's kind of embarrassing because the guys that I have on here today, Dave Benner, they do the heavy lifting. I just read their stuff and share it to you. So Dave, thanks for making me look good. How are you today?
Doing well, Suzanne. Thanks for having me again. And you're selling yourself short. So
I appreciate that. Before we get started, I just want to remind people they can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network. We have a fan page, CRN. Please feel free to join. We have a lot of great discussions on there as well. We are on Twitter. We have a YouTube page. If you're listening live on YouTube, we have a YouTube live chat. So you can join in the discussion there. Please hit that bell, like us, share us, follow us, spread the word. If you can't listen live or watch live on YouTube, then go ahead and follow us on SoundCloud. You can download all of our episodes for free. And we have a Radio Co. link as well with an app. You can hear my past episodes of the Wasatch Report on there, case in point. In fact, following this episode of the Wasatch Report, Dave's going to stick around and we're going to do a special episode of Case in Point. And we're going to talk about McCulloch versus Maryland. Last week or two, we discussed Fletcher versus Peck. And unless you've been to law school or really study this stuff, you've never heard of these cases. That being said, they still have a tremendous impact on our lives today. And we're going to tell you exactly how and why. So you can also send me messages on Facebook live chat and I will respond to them on the air. I will keep your identity private. I'll just share your first name. Can't respond to the other messages on there in writing because I am still serving hard time in the Facebook correctional facility for a comment that was apparently 8 years old. So there's no statute of limitations. And I found some really good articles about Facebook and social media as a prison. We're going to explore that episode, or we're going to explore that topic on an episode later on this week. We also have on our Radio Co. loop some of the History in a Nutshell episodes that Dave has recorded and has generously allowed us to be on there. Today, we're going to talk about a chapter in his book. Again, this is Compact of the Republic, League of States, and the Constitution. You can get that through his webpage. Dave, tell everybody how to get these books.
yeah, you can pick them up at www.davebenner.com. There's links right in the center of the screen. Really appreciate any that you purchase. It's a great gift as well for your friends or family.
You know, I'm a homeschooler, and I have a lot of friends at homeschool. Even if you don't homeschool, your kids are going to be subject to many versions of American and other history. I highly suggest you get these books, educate yourself as well. If you have kids that are a teenage, middle school, high school, this booklet right here, The Incorporation Doctrine, they can read this in an hour, probably 2 hours with all the Snapchat and whatever stuff they do when they're studying. But listen to these, The History in a Nutshell, your podcast, and you can arm your kids against the indoctrination that they're going to be getting from the majority of their history teachers. That being said, we're going to talk about two iconic figures today. One is iconic because he's recognizable. He's on the $10 bill. And yes, he was a founding father, but he also has significant impact on our lives today. The other one is not so recognizable. And thanks to one really, I will say, a notorious case, his name is somewhat recognized because of Marbury versus Madison. I covered that on our debut episode of Case in Point with Dr. Kevin Gutzman, who is the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, as well as several other books. So we have one iconic figure and another that's not quite as well known, but I would say equally have a significant influence on the way we are governed today. We're going to discuss that. We're also going to compare and contrast their influences and the type of government that the states and their delegates consented to, and how that differentiates from what we have thanks to the endeavors of Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall. Dave, let's talk about your book briefly. The number one myth that it dispels, and the point of this book is to let people know that we were not founded as one nation. Explain what this means, compact of the Republic.
Yeah, so the term compact as a legal term means a multi-body contract among sovereign entities. So the main point that my book drives in is the fact that the general government and the Constitution was the creation of these sovereign, independent states. And those states developed separate identities with separate religions and legislatures and judiciaries and executives, mostly because of their distance from England. Ever since they started being settled in the early 17th century, they really and truly developed distinct identities that they carried with them throughout the next 2 centuries.
And is it fair to say that these were sovereign and independent on a par as England and France, Spain?
According to the Declaration of Independence in the 4th section, that's exactly what Jefferson wrote, and that's what the states in the Continental Congress abided by in common cause, because they were saying that these separate states are essentially the same as Great Britain, Spain, the same countries you listed, and as such, they have the power to conclude war and exact peace, etc., on the same par as any other state.
Which really explains why they created a government after a certain amount of time. We know that we operated for a while under the Articles of Confederation, and they decided to form a more perfect union and kind of tweak some of the problems that they saw under the Articles. So they came together to come about with a new government that would have limited purpose. So it was going to be a federal system. Explain the difference between a system of federalism as compared to a system of nationalism. And then what we're going to do is take a case that was recently discovered or decided concerning the Eighth Amendment, whether or not the Supreme Court had the authority to hear this case in the first place or adjudicate the way they did. And then once we realize, when we come to that conclusion, we'll find out how exactly that happened. And that is going to take us back to the topic here, Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall.
Yeah, so the key difference between a federal system and a national system is that a federal system is a place in which political power is disseminated amongst multiple power centers, usually regionally. So in the United States context, under both the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, regardless of your opinion of which is better, both embraced a union-oriented federalist system whereupon most political powers were to reside in the states. The opposite of that is a national system, much like France, where during the French Revolution, the central authority essentially just erased whatever political boundaries in localities existed and replaced it with a system that was convenient for the administration of the central entity. So that's the key difference between those two systems.
And we knew that the states were very reticent to ratify this new form of government, this constitution, because there were certain areas that were delegated. And we're going to talk about the difference between expressly delegated powers and implied powers, because as we were saying before the show started, there are essentially two Alexander Hamiltons, the pre-ratification Alexander Hamilton and the post-ratification Alexander Hamilton. So let's explore a little bit about what were some of the reservations and how did that give cause to what we have as known as the Bill of Rights and the 10th Amendment, and we're going to see if that has been honored.
Yeah, well, there are so many. There are such an amalgam of different concerns and apprehensions various people, usually called the anti-federalists, had against the constitutional framework. And they range from everything from the executive power should be divided into multiple people, to you shouldn't have a federal judiciary, to the concern that this would represent a consolidation of all the states into a single one, to the concern that the House of Representatives wouldn't be representative enough. There are so many different concerns expressed from a multitude of people. And I think it's a little bit of a mistake to kind of lump all the anti-federalists together, because some had, some concerns that others did not, and vice versa. But the chief concern, I think, amongst those that are often called anti-federalists is the concern of a lack of Bill of Rights. So following the tradition of the British Whigs, they wanted something representative of something similar to the English Bill of Rights of 1689, where certain prohibitions would be enacted textually.
And as we understand, the Bill of Rights were intended to just really instill a sense of confidence in the people that this new general government was not going to go beyond the powers that were delegated under Article 1, Section 8. We call those the enumerated powers. They were expressly delegated. Now, we're going to digress for a moment because this is timely here. We just had the Supreme Court weigh in, and Ginsburg actually wrote the opinion. Well, her clerk did, and she signed it probably with help. Yeah. But they just came down with a decision that a lot of, even the Pacific Legal Foundation, are cheering as a victory for our freedoms. I'm no fan of civil asset forfeiture. I don't make any secret about that. But the Supreme Court now has weighed in, applying the Eighth Amendment to the states and saying that the states cannot have civil asset forfeiture, and expanding upon, it's an infraction, it's an infringement upon due process, and it's unfair. I get that. However, was this a case that the Supreme Court should have weighed in on and applied to the states?
No, because as we've discussed before, this represents an embrace of the incorporation doctrine. So what the court is holding is that the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits excessive fines, should be a limitation on the state governments as well. Now, as you say, we don't support civil asset forfeiture, by all means not. But this was a case where the court essentially punted that decision-making process up to the federal government. And I guarantee you, I can almost assure you that the threshold that the federal judiciary will consider excessive will be much more oppressive than individual states. In addition, in the individual states, one has recourse by voting with their feet, moving to another state, and it doesn't create such a rigid precedent that the federal government will exploit. So this is a serious case, and I totally agree with you that, some of the libertarian think tanks were wrong to immediately publish articles to the, that essentially opine that civil forfeiture is over. That's absurd. It might become more oppressive now.
Even Fee had an article that was in favor of this. I love Fee. Tom Mullen.
I love it too.
Tom Mullen, who writes for Fee, also disagreed with the Supreme Court's ruling. So, and I say, when you take these issues to the Supreme Court, you are really rolling the dice, because you are taking a chance of them saying, we're fine with civil asset forfeiture because we really need to control crime. We need to look into the interest of public safety. And we're going to allow this because we see a nexus. They love that word. We see a nexus between these ill-gotten gains and their behavior. And we have to have a means by which to handle this situation. So they could have ruled the other way, just like people were cheering about the baking case again in Colorado, when Kennedy said, well, you can't discriminate against the religion. And I envision him winking, wink, wink, as he says this, because I'm going to tell you how to get away with it. If you do this in a manner that appears to be, meaning doesn't have to be, but it appears to be neutral towards religion, you can compel the baker to bake the cake. So it was a personal victory for him, but it was a loss for the rest of us.
Yeah, totally agree. That's exactly how I read that opinion too. So
yeah, and when the way you explained also the risk we take with going to the Supreme Court, I like to use the national reciprocity argument, and that's still up for debate and discussion. In fact, I said it was a Trojan horse. Our mutual friend Carl Jones and I wrote an article on that, and now they're tying in the enhanced background checks with national reciprocity. So let's get to the meat and taters of the show here. And just a quick comment with regards to the terminology that we're using with regards to the Federalists and the anti-Federalists. I think it's almost a little bit of a misconception when we call the Federalists, you know, there almost seems like they're the good guys. They want the Constitution. They want this form of government. But I like to say that the Federalists and the anti-Federalists were really the Federalists, and the Federalists were the nationalists, given the explanation that you gave.
Yeah, absolutely. And Brian McClanahan really hits on this point pretty hard in his work too. But you're totally right. The Federalists kind of adopted that terminology because they thought it would stick. It was kind of, you know, it was really the most popular American political maxim. So why not adopt it? But you're right. The anti-Federalists championed much more of a decentralized system.
Let's get into Alexander Hamilton, the proponent of the Constitution. There's so much to discuss here. You can get into, I'm going to let you run with this. I'm going to sit here and enjoy my late afternoon cup of coffee. We're going to talk about the pre-ratification, post-ratification, Alexander Hamilton, the expressly versus the implied, the expressly delegated powers. I mentioned enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, versus the implied powers. We have Federalist 81, a lot of stuff here. Dave, work your magic.
Yeah. All right. So Alexander Hamilton, there's so much to be said about him. I mean, we could fill an entire series of episodes on him, but the Alexander Hamilton that's pertinent to this is that Alexander Hamilton had emerged as something of a popular military figure because he led a famous charge at the Battle of Yorktown toward the end of the American Revolution, and he was elected as a delegate from his state. And when the Constitution was being ratified, this was essentially, in many ways, Hamilton's baby, because Hamilton, throughout the 1780s, had been calling for increased powers that would go to the central government. He saw the 1780s as essentially a system of malaise that would not lead to any kind of stability he wanted. And the things he pointed out was that the Confederation lacked a taxing power. The Confederation government under the Articles of Confederation also lacked any kind of law enforcement mechanism. So the states had to kind of enforce the resolutions of Congress, and that there was no way to quell insurrections and things that would be threatening to a fledgling republic. So when the Constitution was ratified, even though Hamilton admitted that this wasn't really the exact form of government he wanted, he did take a leading role in championing its ratification. So that's where I'll stop for now.
And we did have a strong central government that was proposed at the Philadelphia Convention. I've talked about this many times on the show. It's mentioned in your book as well, called the Virginia Plan, the chief proponents of which were James Madison and Edmund Randolph. And this was rejected outright in Philadelphia. In fact, didn't they threaten Madison that this was going to be the end of the negotiations if he didn't back off the Virginia Plan?
Well, certainly there was much opposition to both the Virginia Plan and the plan that Alexander Hamilton offered, which was even more nationalist than the Virginia Plan. But you're right. The Virginia Plan that Madison and Edmund Randolph offered called for 2 houses of the legislature, both apportioned by state population, a supreme judiciary that could essentially take any case of their choosing, and Madison's favorite pet project, and that was the ability to enact a veto power over any state law by the central government. So all of those things were rejected. And by the end of the convention, Hamilton basically admitted that, you know, this is not the type of constitution I want, but it's better than what currently exists. And I think the way he put it essentially was that, you know, all the plans that were offered were different kinds of meat with a changing of the sauce. He wanted a truly British oriented monarchy, essentially. And you can see that from the notes. But
what tactics did he use to encourage people through their states to be supportive of and ultimately ratify the Constitution?
Yeah, so, well, his big case was the case of persuading New York, his home state, where only New York City was essentially supportive of the framework, and the rest of New York was totally opposed in a visceral way. And some of the kind of tactics he used was, and this one doesn't go mentioned very often, but as Forrest McDonald pointed out, he threatened at one point to have New York City secede from the rest of the state and form its own state and ratify the Constitution as a separate entity. Other things that were used in the case of New York was he consistently reiterated that this Constitution is one of enumerated powers, and going beyond the enumerated powers, anything exercised would be illegitimate and void. Another tactic used in New York and 2 other states was to include in the ratification document a resumption clause, which essentially said whenever it affected the state's public happiness, the state could withdraw from the compact, essentially secede. So there were many tactics.
Oh, wait a minute. You mean the states could leave once this was ratified?
I don't want to get too seditious, but yeah, they could.
Wow. Good thing that one never came up in the future, huh? So,
right.
So let's talk a little bit about Federalist 81. What was it that he proposed in there? As we know, the Constitution was barely ratified. I think it passed by, 3 delegate votes in New York?
Yes, it was 30 to 27. New York is such an excellent case study. For anyone interested in the ratification campaign, New York and Virginia are the most important states because the notes are just amazing and basically cover almost all the issues. They run the gamut about all the concerns. But yeah, it was a close battle there.
You know, when you talk about the records of the ratification debates in the books, the information is out there. This is what's so frustrating because what we're doing right now is I'm an attorney, Dave is a historian, and what I tell people, if you want to learn about the Constitution and what it's supposed to mean, people like me are the last ones you go to. And unfortunately, when you go and watch shows like Fox TV, they'll parade out, or any of these stations will parade out whatever pet law professor they have, who will give you his interpretation of the Constitution based on, I talk about this all the time as well, case law. Case law, as we know, is the interpretation by often left-leaning judges, or in the case of Marshall, those who seek to expand the power of the general government. That's the problem when you study case law as opposed to constitutional history. So here you have the best of both worlds. You have a reformed, recovering attorney who understands now the difference, and a historian who really knows his stuff. And again, we're talking out of a chapter in his book, The Hamiltonian and the Marshall Legacy, Compact of the Republics, League of the States, and the Constitution. Let's get into a little bit. Federalist 81, you mentioned in this book here.
Yeah, so my memory is not great, but I think that's the one where Hamilton essentially says that bills of rights are superfluous and thus unnecessary. Is that right? From your understanding.
Hamilton and I believe Madison also did say that they did not need the Bill of Rights because, for instance, with the Second Amendment, there's no authority under Article 1, Section 8 other than arming the military, the militia, to regulate firearms at all. So that was a point of them being absolutely, superfluous. They were unnecessary. Hamilton versus the nature of things, and Hamilton versus Jefferson. You discuss those in your book. Are you ready to expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah, Hamilton versus Jefferson in general.
Sure.
Yeah, so Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury in the United States and Thomas Jefferson as the first Secretary of State in the United States were basically polar opposites on philosophical bounds. Hamilton championed, as we kind of discussed earlier, a semi-monarchical system that was nationalist in orientation, where we would embrace mercantilism, where monopolies would be given to companies. There would be a highly protective tariff. Internal improvements were not really called upon to the extent they would be in later decades, but Hamilton would have been supportive of that. Where in the case of Jefferson, Jefferson was more of a free trader, even though he was personally more of a yeoman farmer. He didn't want the government intruding upon the lives of the average citizen. So Jefferson, also being a strict constructionist when it came to the Constitution compared to Hamilton, thought that the national banking system And all of kind of the Hamiltonian political scheme was not only immoral, but it was unconstitutional, and it would create precedents from which the country would never recover.
Before we get into the national bank issue, and this is going to be, after we cover this, that's going to be the remainder of the show here. Hamilton, with regards to, he was a general. Generals are very pragmatic when it comes to solving problems. We have this incident, you and I discussed this on a previous show, but since this is part of the chapter, I want to just bring this up again, and you can go back and hear this on another episode, but the Whiskey Rebellion. And I've heard different takes on this. Why don't you give a quick recap on the Whiskey Rebellion?
So, as the first excise tax ever imposed by the United States, it was called the whiskey tax, but really it applied to all distilled spirits. Well, what happened was many rural farmers that had distilled spirits, especially in Western Pennsylvania, along the frontier, in other parts of the Western frontier, started to resist and dispute the payment of these taxes. Well, Hamilton did whatever he could to kind of make a show about this. He thought that force needed to be used as soon as possible to quell whatever resistance there were against this, because there were rumblings about secession, liberty poles went up, militias started drilling in Western Pennsylvania, and the governor of Pennsylvania, Thomas Mifflin, seemed to almost sympathize with it to an extent. I don't think he sympathized with it completely, but Hamilton urged Washington as the president, send in the militia, raise the militia, send it out there. Let's create a precedent to put this stuff down. And Washington was really reluctant to actually do that. And a few years passed, but he eventually did, raising the army and kind of leading it out into the field himself. So this was controversial, not only because of the opposition on moral grounds, but this was arguably unconstitutional. And I think it was unconstitutional because not only could the president not unilaterally call up the militia, that was a job for Congress only, but the governor of the state was supposed to authorize any invasion that would quell uprisings, and Thomas Mifflin did not approve. So that's my quick elevator speech on the Whiskey Rebellion.
Well, and this is the thing too, because I mentioned this as well. You mentioned Brian McClanahan earlier, and I agree with his take on this. He should have had the invitation of Thomas Mifflin, the governor of Pennsylvania, before he came in with the military. Brian also explains in his book how Alexander Hamilton screwed up America. That was when Alexander Hamilton took off his Secretary of the Treasury hat and put on his Secretary of the Defense hat, and encouraged Washington to march in there. And I discussed this also with another historian friend of ours, Kevin Gutzman. And I said, well, what is your take on this? He has a different opinion that Alexander Hamilton, being a general, is going to solve the problem. At the time, it was incumbent upon us to appear that we would be a worthy credit risk to the international community. So accordingly, so we would continue to get credit and grow as a nation, pardon my French. We needed to let the rest of the world know that we are a good credit risk because we will use the might and force of the American military, the government's military, to collect taxes that are owed to us. Therefore, you can rest assured we are worthy of being a credit risk. So my response to that was, well, I guess be damned the Constitution and the people that created this government. We are now going to stomp over them and focus more on the court of public opinion in the rest of the world and not what those that created this government consented to. So we kind of threw them under the bus for that term, and all for I guess, a political expediency that needed to be handled. I just think if there was the ability to communicate among the agrarians that we have today, there would have been a mass exodus from this newly formed government. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I have the utmost respect for Professor Gutzman as well, and I happen to just disagree with him a little bit on this. I've also heard him kind of articulate that, well, Washington was just taking it upon his role to, as the Constitution says, execute the laws of the Union. Well, Washington undoubtedly thought the law was constitutional that allowed him to raise the militia, but no law can trump the Constitution, which says that power is in Congress's hands. So we just disagree with that. Totally agree that the financial issue is probably a concern at the top of their minds, but nonetheless, as you think, I believe that that was unconstitutional.
Yeah. Well, let's get into now express versus implied powers. And nowhere does this become more, I think, to the forefront of our discussion with regards to Alexander Hamilton and federalism than with the issue of banks and with finances. Let's bring up also the issue of assumption of the national debt and then how we roll into the banks with that.
Yeah, so the assumption of the national debt, the assumption of the state debts, I'm sorry. So before the Hamiltonian National Bank was even inaugurated, kind of the first objective of Alexander Hamilton was to have all of the state debts that had accrued mostly during the time of the Revolution into a single solitary national debt. His argument was in order to be an effective and solid creditor when it came to foreign nations, these debts had to be assumed at a central level. Well, this was another thing that Hamilton clashed with Jefferson and Edmund Randolph opposed, because they said, number one, the Constitution doesn't give Congress the ability to do this. And number two, this will essentially enslave people because there's no way that the federal government will repay this debt. They don't have any incentive to pay down the debt.
And yes, I apologize because I said assumption of the national debt, but it was the assumption of the state debts that created a national debt, which would in turn help with our credit with that. Let's talk about the constitutionality of the creation of a bank. And we'll get into a little bit more in depth with the Supreme Court understanding of this and Marshall's interpretation when we move over to case in point. But let's talk about Alexander Hamilton's belief about a state bank or about a national bank and how that does or does not conform with the enumerated powers.
Yes, so excellent question. So Alexander Hamilton was a student of the English-oriented banking system, which was really mercantilist in orientation. Hamilton was essentially a protege of Robert Morris. A lot of people don't know that name, but Robert Morris is probably the most important political figure in the early republic outside of George Washington as far as the power he wielded. Well, he, again, was a financier of the American Revolution, and he thought that a central bank was necessary. Well, following in his footsteps, when Hamilton was made Secretary of the Treasury, he argued for a national bank. Now, Washington, the president, at that time, the veto power was acknowledged kind of as a device that would be used by the president whenever he thought an act was unconstitutional. So what he did was he had Edmund Randolph, the Attorney General, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, write separate constitutional opinions about whether this was permissible. Hamilton essentially said it was on the basis of, as you mentioned, the implied powers doctrine. And basically what this is, it's the idea that the necessary and proper clause at the end of Article 1, Section 8, essentially opens up a vast reservoir of powers that aren't expressly enumerated in the rest of Article 1, Section 8. Well, Jefferson, and if someone wants to read some of Jefferson's best writing, I think it is this article. He wrote that he took the Constitution, the foundation of the Constitution, and then quoted the 10th Amendment, expressing the belief that all things not enumerated are impermissible. And he said doing so would, quote, open up a boundless field of power no longer susceptible to any definition. So Jefferson thought this was wrongheaded. The Constitution had been sold in the ratification campaigns as one of only enumerated powers.
So what strikes me also is in your book, you explain that Alexander Hamilton realized that we couldn't pursue the management of the economy and international trade without the existence of a national bank. So knowing that this couldn't happen in a meaningful way, it seems to me that he almost said, I'm just going to get this through, and then we're going to do what we want once this is in effect. Because again, going back to the time and the ability to communicate. I just think that they were able to push this through, and you didn't have the ability for people to rally and get the message across to people like we do today with social media. Even before social media, we had email, we had the telephone, where people could galvanize some sort of a movement that they might realize that this is maybe this is a mistake after all, because here we have again now assumption of state powers. We didn't see that in the Constitution as an enumerated power, and the Virginians saying, wait, we paid our bills. Now we're going to be on the hook. I mean, we're seeing this. This is not a trend that has left American political theater here, where we have those that have paid their bills and being responsible are now, because of national policies, being forced to cover for those that haven't. So I think it's fair to say this is part of the Hamiltonian legacy.
Oh, certainly. Central banking is probably the most defining Hamiltonian aspect that still remains in the U.S. political system. The implied powers doctrine is, though, as well. So you're right.
So we had a first national bank. What happened to that?
So the First National Bank was a 20-year charter, and it expired in 1811. And actually, it wasn't renewed right away. It took until after the culmination of the War of 1812, where some people were arguing, well, if we would have had a central bank, we could have financed this war a lot easier. And Madison basically signed the bill extending the national bank for a second term. That became known as the Second National Bank.
Madison was originally opposed to the national bank, was he not?
This is one of the most ironic aspects. Madison actually led the congressional opposition to the first Bank of the United States because he thought it was unconstitutional, it was unnecessary, and he basically did everything he could to defeat it. However, by the time of his presidency, he had essentially rendered an opinion saying essentially that President had decided this, and under the first Congress, including the hand of the president, decided that this was constitutionally permissible. I think it is the most unforgivable aspect of Madison's political career, and I think Kevin Gutzman has written to that extent as well.
Yeah, I think he calls it his flip-flop in his book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. And we see this is a travesty that continues on to this day, and not just when we're talking about congressional acts, for instance, chartering a bank. We see this in the judiciary as well, and we'll get into that with the principle of stare decisis. So we see this also. We've been doing this so long. I discussed Scalia's opinion in McDonald, where he talks about incorporating the Bill of Rights against the Second Amendment against the states, and he even says, I have my disagreements or my reservations about substantive due process, but he essentially says, we've been doing it for so long, I'm going to acquiesce. So this is nothing that's gone away. And, Clyde Wilson, in his book Nullification, he doesn't have many kind things to say about Hamilton. In fact, he says, Madison, those that quote Madison for justifying certain aspects of the Constitution really don't show that they're likely to understand the deeper meaning of what went on in that time. So I try to get away from Madison, but I also try to show that this is kind of a barometer. It's kind of the pulse of the feeling. And he did of the people at that time. So that being said, remember also he did veto his own bill for infrastructure from the proceeds of the bank. He wanted one of these. So in his defense, he said, look, we're going to use the proceeds from, I believe it was the Second National Bank, right? Because he signed in that charter and said, we're going to use that to pay for infrastructure.
Yeah, the bonus bill veto. That's basically his last major act of office. And totally agree. That's kind of Jekyll and Hyde Madison, what you're articulating now, because when it comes to originalism, his bonus bill veto is basically an amazing piece of language, but the extension of the national bank is not.
Yeah. And, to be fair, he said, I want this, but you didn't amend the Constitution. Therefore, I have to view it. But, the guy was kind of schizophrenic how he went back and forth, which is why Clyde Wilson says he's really not a great resource. There are a lot of others that we can use. So let's talk a little bit about this Second National Bank, and does the government have the power to issue these essentially charters? And then we'll work our way into Marshall a little bit. We'll just briefly touch on Marbury versus Madison. Then when we end this show, we'll get into McCulloch versus Maryland.
Yeah, well, no. I mean, the Federalists that advocated for the U.S. Constitution, again, said that this is a document of expressly enumerated powers. That among those powers is nothing that permits Congress to charter a corporation. And it's actually really interesting because if you look back at the notes of the Philadelphia Convention that Madison took, the Pennsylvania delegation actually recommended this as a power to be added to the Constitution, and it was struck down in Philadelphia. So not only does this not exist, there is recorded evidence that shows that it was deliberate that this power would not be included. Well, as you said, Hamilton basically said, well, it's convenient that a banking institution can collect and distribute funds and fund wars, etc. But he even admitted that it wasn't expressly allowed under the Constitution. He had kind of ancillary supports for it.
And I believe Federalist 81 was one of the documents where he did distinguish between the expressed versus the, he didn't even mention implied powers, I should say, but he sold this as well to his fellow New Yorkers as a document that would only have the enumerated powers, this new government. You didn't need to be afraid. I find it interesting also when you look at how New York City was overwhelmingly in support of this, but the more agrarian people in the rural areas were not. And this goes deeper into the Hammersonian Jeffersonian split that we have with the mercantilists versus the agrarians and their differences with decentralization on the latter, and Hamilton wanting, first of all, the monarch, as we know, but the strong central government. And once it was ratified, it was almost like, now I've got the means by which we can do what was rejected outright in Philadelphia. And I've already shown with our own version of shock and awe what happens if you try to say no to this United States government now. What was Hamilton's opinion of the role of the states with regards to the central government? Were they still sovereign and independent, or because I think they were your subsidiaries, more like counties in a state?
Yeah, well, as you allude to, I think we can glean a lot from actually the precise plan that Hamilton offered in the Philadelphia Convention for a government framework. And his framework essentially called for a literal consolidation of the states and a role for the president, which would be a hereditary monarch, to appoint the state governors, essentially. So there wouldn't really be the same kind of federalist system. So he was dead set philosophically on a national system. Now, as you allude to, he did a 180 after ratification, and boy, was it a duplicitous one in my estimation, because in Federalist 33, he essentially said that the necessary and proper clause, the Constitution would be the exact same whether that clause was included or not. But after that, in proposing his national bank and really selling it, especially to Washington, he said that, the implied powers doctrine, this allows all sorts of powers that aren't expressly delegated.
Well, I forgot which founder said it, but they said a constitution with implied powers or unlimited is just the same as having no constitution at all. I say that we have reverted back, and even from the very beginning, to a system of parliamentary sovereignty where England didn't have a written constitution. Accordingly, pretty much anything that Parliament came up with was going to be legal. And now it seems like we were promised a bill of goods. Alexander Hamilton also said the same thing. We have enumerated powers. You don't have to worry about anything else. Once it came through, we saw a very quick change. I am of the opinion that he never was genuine about his promises from the very beginning. I don't think that you could promise one thing and just go completely into policies that are diametrically opposed to what you proposed and other people, to their detriment, relied on. In the world of contracts, we call that fraud. What is the equitable remedy for fraud? It is to rescind your contract, meaning the states had every legal right to secede. And we had several instances where northern states had threatened to before. So let's start bringing Marshall into this discussion. And John Marshall he was a Supreme Court justice. He was not at the Philadelphia Convention, yet he was present at the Virginia ratification debates. Folks, I encourage you, if you really want to understand what the Constitution was intended to become, read, especially if you want to just read New York and Virginia, as Dave Benner here says, are the most important two. Read those, understand that the government that operates under the consent of the governed is what we were supposed to be operating under. They did a bait and switch. And look at the amount of representation you have, what this has morphed into, and ask yourself realistically, are we really operating under a system of consent of the governed? That being said, let's talk about some of Marshall's behavior. He was present for the Virginia ratification conventions. He knew what he was doing. Let's talk about a few cases before we wrap up this hour and then go into case in point.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds good. So, all right, go. So the most pivotal one, and you mentioned it much earlier, is Marbury versus Madison, where the key thing to come from that, I don't want to rehash that. You and Kevin did an awesome job on that one. All listeners, take a look at that episode on SoundCloud. But the key thing to take away from that is that Marshall essentially opined that the judiciary has the ability not only to strike down laws. That wasn't actually that controversial if you look at the ratification notes. But the big thing is he harangued the Jefferson administration for having a different opinion on the constitutional tasks that applied only to the executive. And what I mean by that was Jefferson didn't want John Adams' appointee to become a district court judge. So he wasn't going to sign the commission and make sure to deliver it. Instead, he told Madison, the Secretary of State, don't deliver it. But nonetheless, Marshall basically harassed him and criticized him for that. Another case we talked about recently was Fletcher versus Peck in 1810. And the key thing to take away from that, I think, is that Marshall essentially said the Contracts Clause, which exists in Article 1, Section 9, makes contracts that are coded in fraud legally binding, even if the state in question tries to reverse the fraud within the contract, it's still legally binding. One other one was Ogden versus Gibbons, which we talked about a little bit earlier, is that he argued that the Commerce Clause extends to navigable waters so that the U.S. Congress would have the ability to regulate commerce traveling over waterways. So Marshall was a quintessential nationalist. He really was Hamiltonian in his vision for both implied powers and the nationalization of political power.
When we talk about contracts law, your book is making the claim that sovereign and independent states came together and had a contract. Well, how do we know what the terms are of the contract? It's what the parties consented to, and we look at the ratification records for that. And this is what's so egregious about Marshall. He was in Virginia at the ratification debates. He knew it was promised. And then he starts using his position as a member of the federal judiciary to tweak the system of government into one that suits his purposes. And this is something that has been done before the ink was dry in the holy parchment. I encourage people, again, start with this one, the 14th Amendment and the incorporation doctrine. Go to davebenner.com. If you want to get more into this, read Government by Judiciary by Raoul Berger, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution by Kevin Gutzman, The Founding Fathers Guide to the Constitution by Brian McClanahan. There are just so many competent historians out there that will actually provide you with truthful history, as opposed to the David Bartons that are telling you one nation, indivisible. The thing about Justice Marshall is Marbury versus Madison is the one case from this era that you and I are talking about, these esoteric cases. The case really didn't have a lot of implication with regards to the facts presented to the court in and of itself. It was pretty minor. That being said, what people take away from it is judicial review. It gives the impression that whatever the Black Robe Messiahs say is the law of the land, with the very cursory examination you get in high school and college, even in law school. That's the impression that is given. And Dave, you mentioned the federal veto over state laws. What was rejected outright in Philadelphia has been now the MO of this government, exercising their superiority over the states vis-a-vis the federal judiciary. And what I see here, what John Adams did was he tried to use weaponize the federal judiciary to keep the Federalists, the Nationalists in office, perpetuate their control after they were outright rejected in what we call the Revolution of 1800, which was essentially the death knell of the Federalist Party. So we also have, again, the federal judiciary, the weaponization of the federal judiciary, fraud, where he essentially said you cannot rescind a contract predicated on fraud. Absolutely insane ruling. And Givens versus Ogden, again, the Commerce Clause was intended to keep trade regular. It was never intended to make the general government have control over all things according to trades. Essentially, our good friend Carl Jones says the Constitution did two things: set up a system for a common defense and a free trade zone. Let's talk a little bit. We'll do a case in point on Ogden, but let's talk a little bit about Givens versus Ogden, because as we have seen egregious uses of the Commerce Clause to exponentially increase the scope and power of the general government.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great one to point to as a bad precedent because, as you said, there's been case after case after case that have come in the decades since Ogden versus Givens, which have extended that. I think one of the three most egregious Supreme Court opinions ever is Wickard versus Filburn. And that's a case where a man essentially grew a surplus of wheat that was beyond what the court decided that would be necessary to feed his family. And in return for that, they decided that the Supreme Judiciary would have the power to regulate independent growings of crops that one consumes and grows within their own property. I mean, this can be taken to such an incredible extent. And even Clarence Thomas, who I don't always agree with, opined in the Angel versus Raich opinion that this would be akin to basically regulating potlucks and garage sales. It would just be absurd.
Well, this is, again, we can thank the rulings early on from John Marshall for what I consider an evil case, Fletcher versus Peck. Again, that was a New Deal era case where we had FDR's administration interfering with wheat prices and other agricultural, pretty much everything else. But what I remember my law school teacher explaining this case, that this farmer just wanted to grow enough wheat on his property to feed his own family and his own cows. It was never going to cross state lines, meaning state commerce. And the way it was explained was just the act of growing your own wheat affects interstate commerce. Therefore, we are going to assert control over what you do on your own land. And they haven't stopped there. I'll tell you how egregious this is. I had a friend who had a form of cancer called multiple myeloma. And to treat this form of cancer, you have to do a form of chemo that absolutely destroys the immune system. Then, before that, they harvest your stem cells. They process this and then reintroduce your stem cells and start all over. And this person, they harvest enough for 2 treatments. That's the only thing they can do. After my friend had the first harvest, now the feds get in and assert control over the stem cells harvested from your own body. What are they going to do with this? You know, you go down these hypotheticals, look at now general government managed healthcare. You know what? This guy, he's getting kind of old, and we've got somebody else that could possibly use these stem cells. We know they're his, but we control them. And the basis they use, the justification for the control of the stem cells, because you could have somebody that never, ever leaves that state, okay? Well, the machines they use to collect them cross state lines. Therefore, we're going to regulate them. So this is how crazy this gets. And you can thank this bastardization of the Commerce Clause going all the way back. Again, the ink wasn't even dry on the parchment. This is Hamiltonian and Marshall's legacy all the way. You also mentioned California versus race. I discussed that as well, because this is how Antonin Scalia, who is considered the originalist, the textualist, how did he justify the behavior of the Drug Enforcement Agency? He based it upon an overall government scheme that was comprehensive. What was that? The Controlled Substances Act. Dave, you're the historian. Please find me the constitutional authority for the Controlled Substances Act. I will wait.
All right. It may take a while, but just give me a few millennia here. So
it affects interstate commerce. We've got about 5 minutes left. What else have we left out? We talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. There's a quote in here that you said, Alexander Hamilton is a clear foe of the Constitution's original ratification understanding. The original understanding is taught to us again by case law. This is why it is so important to not look to what the Supreme Court says. It is so frustrating when you hear, well, the Supreme Court said, I'll give you another example. When the Affordable Care Act, which we know is neither affordable nor caring, was being debated. You have these debates stupidly. I used to do this on Facebook about the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. And this was right after Roberts did his little about face and upheld the mandate. And a gal said to me, well, the Supreme Court said that it's constitutional. And I think these judges know more about the Constitution than you. Don't you think? I said, no, actually, I don't. I really don't. And that sounds pretty darn arrogant when you say you understand the Constitution better than one of the black robe messiahs. But ladies and gentlemen, that is the truth. This is what I refer to as the malfeasance of the legal education industry. And that's what it is. It is just a branch of big government. They perpetuate the myth. Again, when we talk about McCulloch versus Maryland, which is what we're going to go into next, the author of a book on that topic was on C-SPAN, and Kevin Gutzman actually was watching a little bit, and he said that the author made the claim that the states joined together with the nation to come up with this Constitution. I mean, he equated that to being present for your own conception.
Yeah, I would like to hear or eavesdrop on anything he watches when it comes to, legal scholars, like you say, because this, Suzanne, as a legally trained lawyer that went through law school, that it's the case law that's being studied because the lawyers have to know how to win their case. They're not actually studying their ratification, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a dead letter. And I tell people right now that we are living in a post-constitutional society. I said the other day that the constitutional crisis that we have is the fact that we have this Constitution. It was set up in a way, the more I study it, the more I'm of the opinion that it was a Trojan horse, and there were certain entities that were being quiet and silent and knew if we could just get this passed because of, again, the agrarian nature of many of the people that are against a strong national government, they're going to be so busy with their daily, subsistence and managing their plantations, their households, their farms. They're not going to be keeping on top of all this. And by the time we really get this government strong, that we get the debt that we know that we need, the credit from the international community, we're going to run roughshod over this and essentially get what we want. And that's what we're seeing with these early case law decisions. So I encourage everybody to follow Dave Benner on Facebook, davebenner.com. You can order the books there. Again, the 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine, Compact of the Republic, the League of States and the Constitution. You have history in a nutshell. And tell us about your podcast, how people can listen to that. We've got 1 minute and then we're going to hop over to the other show.
Sure. www.davebenner.com is also the hub that you can find my podcast. I'm doing a complete series on the struggle for American independence. So I'm starting with the years just after the French and Indian War and how strains started to develop between Great Britain and the future states, then colonies. So right now I'm up to the part where the cause of independence needed a spokesman, and Thomas Paine published Common Sense. So use that drop down on my page.
Awesome. I'm going to be listening to those. And just so you know, we're going to be having Dave here as a regular as much as he can. And also our good friend Andrew says that his 95-year-old dad loved your book, Compact. That being said, we're going to wrap this one up and then we're going to hop over and do an episode of Case in Point. I'm Suzanne Sherman on behalf of my good friend Dave Benner and Jeff Johnson, who's manning the controls here. I want to thank you. This is the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. Thanks for listening. Welcome, everybody, to Case in Point. I'm Suzanne Sherman. I'll be your host for the Cerberus Radio Network here, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. I'm welcoming back a good friend of mine, Dave Benner. He is the author of Compact of the Republic, the League of States, and the Constitution, and a book that should be mandatory reading for every single person that wants to have a say in our political system here, the 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine. We just wrapped up a show of the Wasatch Report, where we discussed the legacy of Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall, two figures, the former more iconic than the latter, but both have lasting influence on our existence today. You can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network. We have a fan page, CRN, on Facebook as well. We are on Twitter, on SoundCloud. Please like us, follow us. If you like what you hear, share the word. Dave, welcome to Case in Point. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me again and really appreciate it.
I know this sounds redundant because we just cranked out a live show. Let's do a repeat of how people, because if they're not listening live and they're on SoundCloud or YouTube, catching you later, let's repeat for the people that are only hearing this episode how they can follow you and get your books.
Yeah, so anyone can follow me at www.davebenner.com. That's DAVEBENNER. And right in the middle of the page, you can find a link to get my books. I also have a podcast dropdown and a YouTube dropdown. I publish a podcast that's a narrative. Right now I'm covering the struggle for American independence, and my YouTube series is called History in a Nutshell, where I break down individual episodes in the early republic and the critical period, the constitutional period, etc., that condenses those topics down into 5 to 8 minute bite-sized segments so it's palatable.
You know what I love about those two is, again, I talk about homeschooling parents. Even if your kids are not being homeschooled, have them listen to these. These are short enough that you can bribe them to pay attention for a few minutes and plant some seeds, get them interested. I really had no interest in history, believe it or not, growing up, because the traditional means of teaching it are just trying to hammer home dates and names without really telling the story. And you do such a great job of telling the story and keeping it interesting. So I encourage everybody to listen. Let's hit it right now. McCulloch versus Maryland. This was a case out of from 1819. This is your era. I know you are so strong on these topics. This was really a test case for the extent of the power of Congress. As we discussed earlier, we had a system of government that was set up with enumerated powers going to a general government. Anything that wasn't specifically enumerated was going to remain with the states. The states came together, as you explain in your book, sovereign and independent on a par of the nations of France, Spain, England, came together to essentially set up a common defense system and a free trade zone. As we saw early on, and we discussed in the episode on the Wasatch Report, the general government soon started casting off the yokes, its restraints, and doing what it wanted, which is essentially what we think Alexander Hamilton knew they would do. He had a cohort in this era, and that was a member of the federal judiciary, Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. McCulloch versus Maryland, again, a test case for the extent of congressional powers. Why don't you tell us about the facts of this case?
All right, so how this case grew to such importance was a result of the charter of what's called the Second National Bank of the United States. So the First National Bank, it's sometimes called Hamilton's Bank, was created in 1791, and it had a 20-year charter. So that charter expired in 1811. Several years went by, and the War of 1812 developed. And following the war, there was some sentiments from various politicians, namely people that would become known as the American Whigs, that basically said there needed to be another central bank, or the second bank of the United States. Well, the president at that time was James Madison. And ironically enough, it was Madison that led the congressional opposition to Madison or Hamilton's bank in 1791, but now faced with this decision, decided to sign the legislation into effect, enacting another 20-year charter for the Second National Bank. And Madison essentially argued that precedent had basically settled this question at the time of the first Congress and by the hand of George Washington. Well, this was very controversial. And as a result of that, you see a few states deciding to resist this. And they did it in just amazing, shrewd ways. And it's just kind of funny. It's fun for libertarians to talk about this, but what happened in one state, the one that we'll be talking about today, is in Maryland. The state legislators decided to pass an act that taxed any notes not originating from state banks. And, you know, libertarians are always the ones that are critical of taxes and say that taxes are so egregious and everything. But I think when you're taxing a tyrannical institution, I think I support that. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. So that's where this case starts, and that's where I'll stop for now.
Yeah, because my notes here, because I've also been studying this case again, that I say here that Maryland's response to a national bank was that they imposed an annual fee. It was $15,000. That's a pretty hefty fee if you think about what the money was actually worth by then. The bank refused to pay. Maryland sues, and then we have to ask, was the Maryland law constitutional? Was the national bank constitutional? We went into that in great detail in our last show on the Wasatch Report. If you missed that, essentially, we had a discussion of expressed versus implied powers. And the Hamiltonian perspective was, well, this is pursuant to necessary and proper. We need to have a national bank so we can have credit and we can operate within the worldwide financial economy and control our economy here. So it seems to me that, again, going back to the last episode, Hamilton was disingenuous in his promises as to the limited nature of this government. So let's go back to McCulloch versus Maryland. We have a national bank. Maryland says, fine, I'm going to tax you. Feds say, no, you can't. What happens?
So what happened is, as you said, the bank sued and the case went to the state court first in Maryland. And what happened was Maryland's court basically said, and this is a quote directly from their opinion, the Constitution is silent on the subject of banks. And they were totally right along Jeffersonian lines because according to the enumerated powers doctrine, as we talk about, only the powers expressly delegated in Article 1, Section 8 could be carried out by the Congress. And this was the oppositional argument way back in 1791. So Maryland's basically saying that the bank should not even exist in the first place, and thus this law is constitutional, this Maryland law. Well, the bank wouldn't have that, and a young lawyer who would become one of the most pivotal figures of his era, Daniel Webster, took this case to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, with Marshall presiding, Webster argued that, hey, precedent had settled this way back in 1791. In addition, Webster also argued that a bank was necessary to carry out some of the functions that the Constitution articulates. So just as Hamilton put it in his justification of the bank, it's not a defined enumerated power, but it is an implied power. And that's what's called the implied powers doctrine, the idea that you can take powers not enumerated and utilize them to enact other powers.
Can you give me an example of something that the general government cannot do under the auspices or justification of implied powers?
They can't fund education.
But they do.
But they do. But they do. Do they ever? Do they ever, Susan?
And it's funny because we have devolved, I'll have to say, from a system where we had enumerated powers to implied powers to it doesn't say we can't, therefore we're going to do it anyway. I'm going to be generous when I say it doesn't say we can't. I think we've gotten to the point now, again, I say this all the time, we're a post-constitutional society. We're going to do it anyway because we simply feel that it's needed and we're going to provide that. Hell with the 10th Amendment, states be damned. They're just mere subsidiaries now. So where does this leave us with McCulloch versus Maryland?
All right, so this gets to the Supreme Court. Marshall and the primarily packed by Federalist Supreme Court, and really Marshall was the most guiding figure here. He did whatever he could to whip all the justices into line, issued an opinion that basically articulated three main arguments. So let's cover all these, and then there's an irony I want to point out. We'll take a pause maybe before that, if that's fine. The first is that he argued that precedent had settled this question, just as kind of Madison did when he was signing the bank into effect. He said that the first Congress had basically decided this question when it was pressing upon the public. And the way he put it here was there were, quote, that the bank was supported by, quote, arguments which convinced minds as pure and intelligent as the country can boast. So he was really, really rigid about this. The second argument Marshall made, and this is really the first articulation of this idea ever, is that the Constitution was not ratified by the states, and thus the states don't have their own sovereign powers, but instead, he argued, the general government was essentially ratified by one American people in the aggregate. Well, we know by Article 7 in the Constitution that's not true. It plainly says there that this is a constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. So the states independently decided these questions. The third thing Marshall argued was that essentially necessary does not mean absolutely necessary. And what I mean by that is he said that the lack of the term expressly in the necessary and proper clause allows for the implied powers doctrine. So what he was doing was he was taking what Hamilton said way back in his bank opinion in 1791 and solidifying that as a matter of legal precedent. So now implied powers is a stare decisis oriented policy that we have never returned from.
Yeah, we never go back. We never see government shrinking once it takes more power for itself. It's interesting to note as well that the counsel for Maryland was a gentleman by the name of Luther Martin, who was present at the Philadelphia Convention. Again, Marshall was not. Luther Martin had to sit there and listen to Marshall's lies about what you explain in this book, The Compact of the Republic. Again, this homogeneous American one united people, notwithstanding the delegates ratified the Constitution. That's a direct contravention to all the history we have. And also we have irrefutable proof in the document itself, Article 7. Why don't you explain what Article 7 is? And again, this show's only going to be about 15 minutes long. So we're going to get into that and then a little bit of Luther Martin, and then we'll wrap up what Marshall's arguments were.
Sure. You basically read my mind. I'm bringing up Luther Martin because that was the irony I wanted to point out. There's kind of an addendum to that. But as far as Article 7 goes, it basically is the most definitive proof, and I include this in my book, assuring that the Constitution is a compact. It's not just a unilateral agreement decided upon by a referendum of all Americans. It's a compact, a generally ratified contract between the powers, being the states, in common cause. And what they did was they elected independent state ratification conventions to only decide this one question. So in each of the states, including New York, Delaware, Rhode Island, eventually Virginia, etc., they had special elections, and you elected delegates based on their opinions about what they said about whether or not they'll ratify. So this was not America in the aggregate. Article 7 makes clear that the Constitution is a compact.
So we have a Supreme Court justice who took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. He was present at the ratification convention in Virginia. Do you think he took his oath seriously?
It's almost like you're hurling a softball over home plate for me to knock over the fence, Suzanne. No, I don't. And you're totally right. If not the first or second, Marshall was really the third leading Federalist figure in the Virginia ratification convention. And he knew the promises that were being made and what the delegates took into account when they decided on ratification. And as you mentioned, Luther Martin, who was just a brilliant man and one of the best lawyers of his time, he argued, even though he was dead set against the Constitution, as you know, he admitted that this is not what we decided. And it's extra ironic because it was Luther Martin's language that became the basis of the Supremacy Clause. So he knew more than anyone that this did not mean that every single law passed by the general government was supreme if it clashed with the enumerated powers doctrine. He knew, as Marshall didn't claim to, that this was just a farce.
I think that's one of the other most misunderstood clauses in the document. Again, the Supremacy Clause. I remember this day because I loved studying government. I had a senior year high school civics class, and I just was like a sponge. And unfortunately, I was soaking up a lot of raw sewage, not good history. And what we were taught was, well, the Supremacy Clause means that anytime you have a federal and a state law conflict, the federal law will always trump, no pun intended, the state law. So for instance, with the issue of air quality, California was free to have their own air quality standards. They just couldn't be more stringent. They couldn't be more lenient than the federal ones because the federal government set up the standard for air quality. Well, Jeff is in the background while he's manning the controls and the levels. He can look under Article 1, Section 8 for air quality management, environmental protection, and so on and so forth. So we really have this default that we tend to lean towards anything coming from this federal government is going to be the supreme law of the land, but we ignore the caveat that it has to be in pursuance to the Constitution, particularly Article 1, Section 8. Anything else you want to add to this?
Just in summary, and the chief idea to take out of this, if you're a listener that doesn't really want to pay attention to all the particulars or is interested in that aspect, this was just a pivotal moment for federalism, and federalism lost. That's the chief thing to take out of McCulloch versus Maryland. And like we've discussed, we've really never returned to this. Almost every time the judiciary strikes down a law, it's almost always a state law. And Fletcher versus Peck and McCulloch versus Maryland especially kind of solidified that precedent forever.
And they weren't done yet. And we will be discussing a case called Barron versus Baltimore. Dave's going to come back and we're going to get into one where Marshall actually gets it right. So you're not going to want to miss that episode. Stay tuned, listen to further episodes. Follow Dave Benner, one of my absolute favorite historians. Great books. I love having you on the show, Dave. So appreciate your commentary. We're a good team. We have to do this. We have to do this more often. And so we're going to wrap up this episode. Follow Dave Benner, davebenner.com. Go ahead, order his books. Have your kids watch his videos. If you have kids in school, family members that are getting interested, there are a few sources I really recommend, and this is one of them. So on behalf of those of us here on Cerberus Radio Network, I want to thank you for listening.